Hello everyone, this is Sam of Historiansplaining. A historian tells you why everything you know is wrong. These lectures are on SoundCloud, Podbean, YouTube, and other platforms. And if you can help to keep them coming, please go to my Patreon page. The link is in the description. So this will be my first lecture on Italy, where I'll discuss the emergence of the national movement and the unification of the country in the 19th century. And why Italy? Well, in part, this is a follow-up on my series that I finished last year on the origins of the First World War. So some people asked, what about Italy? When I had discussed all the other countries that became involved in the war, from Germany to Russia to Japan. And I left out Italy at the time because Italy is unusual. It was the last major state in Europe to enter into the war. And in fact, this month, May, is the 110th anniversary of when Italy first mobilized and declared war on the 22nd and 23rd of May, 1915, and then first engaged in fighting against the Austro-Hungarians in June 1915. So in a way, this is sort of following a recreation of the chronology of the outbreak of the war to discuss Italy 1 year later. But I expect in this lecture I won't go all the way up to that point. I'm going to focus on the 19th century and particularly on the revolutionary period. And then hopefully later I'll continue, maybe in the next few weeks, and post another lecture going up to Italy's actual entrance into the war. So why am I focusing more on this earlier period, whereas with all those other countries I didn't? Well, that is partly because Italy is unusual in other ways as well. In a sense, it was the only country involved in the First World War that jumped ship. So, as of the beginning of the 20th century, Italy was aligned diplomatically with Austria-Hungary and Germany. It was one of the so-called Central Powers, but it ended up switching sides and entering the war with the Allies. And in order to understand why that happened, you really have to know this deep earlier history. I think Italy, especially out of all these countries, was very much shaped and haunted by its prehistory and its old struggles and enmities. Also, just more broadly in general, the unification of Italy is one of the great dramatic stories in modern history. And, as an American historian, I know historians talk all the time about the age of revolutions, particularly of Atlantic revolutions, right? Running from the American Revolution through France and Haiti and on up to Spanish America. And sometimes they also will refer to Europe. But if you think of a sort of broad age of revolutions that includes 1848, that enormous outbreak that swept through much of the Western world, Italy was not only fully part of that, it was really, you could say, the epicenter of it. It was the place actually where the 1848 revolutions both began and ended. Right? They started with an uprising in Sicily and ended with the fall of the last revolutionary republics, which were in Venice and Rome. And it's also fully part, I think, of this greater Atlantic sphere of upheaval, revolution. It's interesting that sometimes people are a bit surprised when they find out that Garibaldi, the great military leader of Italian unification, actually spent about a decade in South America, taking part in the revolutionary struggle in Uruguay. And also that later, during the U.S. Civil War, President Lincoln offered Garibaldi a field command for the Union, but Garibaldi stipulated that he would only do it if he was made the overall commander-in-chief and if Lincoln abolished slavery, which at that juncture he would not do. So all of these revolutionary stories of all sorts are interconnected across the ocean and across national lines, and Italy is inseparable from that whole story, at the same time that it's very much a national story. And lastly, I would say the transformation of Italy into a nation state is one of the most extraordinary metamorphoses that's happened in known history, and it's often compared to the unification of Germany, and certainly there are a lot of parallels and connections there. But in many ways, I think you can also see it as more similar to Japan, which I talked about in my lecture on Japan in the First World War, and how that country was so rapidly transformed in the Meiji Restoration. And in Italy, you see a sort of similar program of national renewal and reinvention that is astoundingly successful in turning a disunited and relatively isolated country into a modern national state and a serious force in the world. So to explain this transformation, we have to start arbitrarily at some point, right, before, in sort of the Ancien Régime, right, reconstruct what was the status quo in this world before this transformation. So broadly speaking, in the 1700s, Italy had recovered from much of the catastrophes of the 15 and 1600s. Italy was relatively peaceful as compared to those earlier centuries. It was relatively free of foreign occupation. There were not large foreign armies garrisoned or ravaging the countryside as they had done through much of the 15 and 1600s. The plague was relatively contained in Italy, and there was some limited degree of prosperity and population growth. But population growth in a country like Italy that is already pretty densely populated could backfire. So the growing population meant that there was a great demand for land, and there could be great tensions between the peasants and their landlords and large landholders, including the church. And this sometimes in the 1700s did lead to unrest and violence, especially in the countryside and the small villages. Politically, Italy was not a country or a nation or a state. It was just a geographic expression. It was a landmass that was fragmented into many small states, each of which had a different government. But there were some basic social commonalities. The social order through all these states was very stratified. There was a defined noble class with certain prerogatives and immunities, and this was true even in the republics. Like we talked about Venice, there was a noble class with the right to seats in the Grand Council, even in the Republic of Venice. And outside of these noble classes, most of the people throughout Italy were common peasants and townspeople, largely illiterate, who owed high rents or service to their landlords. There also was very deep and extensive church power. In all states throughout Italy, Catholicism was the state religion. Some of these states did allow small minorities of Protestants or of Jews, mainly confined to ghettos. And throughout Italy, the church controlled the school systems, the universities, and a great deal of the valuable land, especially through the religious orders, like monastic orders or mendicant orders like the Dominicans and Franciscans. But at the same time, there was great geographic variety and fragmentation. There was huge linguistic variation through the different parts of Italy, such that people really spoke basically different languages in the different parts of Italy. Modern Italian that we hear today is more or less based on Tuscan. That was what was adopted as standard Italian, but that was just the dialect spoken in Tuscany in the area around Florence. If you went to the northeast, to Venice, you'd hear an extremely different dialect, such that, it's really arbitrary to even consider it the same language. Same in the northwest, you'd hear something more similar to Provençal or Occitan. And in the far south, especially in Sicily, the language was so different that basically a Sicilian and a Venetian couldn't understand each other. They were not mutually comprehensible. It was more or less like an English speaker trying to speak to a Dutch speaker. And politically, as I said, the country, if you can even call it that, was divided among many small states and statelets. And even within these states, power was highly divided and localized. The political map was fractal-like, with many small interlocking jurisdictions, with control over taxes, property and family law, local armies, etc. And these various states were comparatively weak, decentralized, and outmoded, especially as compared with the larger dynamic powers to the north, like France, Britain, and Austria. Now, to be more specific, because these different states will come into play in different ways in the revolutionary era, to be specific, if we approach the country starting from the south, right, which is not normally how people do it, right? The north is more modernized, more connected to the rest of Europe. But if we start from the Mediterranean Sea, which, surrounds almost all of Italy, and approach from the south, we would see first, of course, the large island of Sicily, and then the lower end of the peninsula, Calabria, the so-called toe of the boot, Apulia to the east, the heel of the boot, and then further up the region of Campania and the large port city of Naples. So in the 1700s, all of those southern areas were all part of one kingdom, commonly called the Kingdom of Naples, although Sicily was still sort of technically its own jurisdiction called the Kingdom of Sicily, but they were all under the rule of one single ruling dynasty, a branch of the Bourbon dynasty, originally from Spain, and they ruled from Naples, and generally this whole domain was called the Kingdom of Naples. If one then goes further north to the area around Rome and east and northward of Rome, there was a large sprawling domain under the direct rule of the Pope, and those are just generally called the Papal States or the Papal Domains. Then as one goes further north, the landscape is even more fragmented. There's a series of smaller duchies, republics, and one kingdom. So as for the duchies, the largest of these was the Grand Duchy of Tuscany, with its capital at Florence. And then there were various smaller duchies arrayed to the north of Tuscany, including Ferrara, Modena, Mantova, Parma, and Milan in the far north. There were also several republics scattered around the north. In the northeast, there was the Republic of Venice, which we've discussed. In the northwest, the slightly smaller Republic of Genoa, centered on that port city of Genoa. And then also in a small enclave within Tuscany, there was the small Republic of Lucca. And then beyond these, there were also even smaller states and principalities that were periodically taken over by their neighbors. So sometimes independent, sometimes not. And the longest lasting of these were the tiny Republic of San Marino, set within the Papal States, sort of up in the northeast corner of the Papal States, and the small Principality of Monaco on the northwest coast past Genoa. Now, aside from all of these states and statelets, the largest political entity in the north and the only actual kingdom, the one that could technically be called a kingdom, was the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia, which is a sort of odd composite state. You can maybe tell just from the name. It was rather like the Empire of Austria, kind of in miniature version, in the sense that it had been built up over many centuries by acquisitions by the ruling dynasty. And this kingdom comprised a set of mainland domains called Piedmont in the far northwest of Italy, and the island of Sardinia, which is in the Mediterranean west of the peninsula. So if we look for a moment just at Piedmont, and we'll get back to the history of this further later, but if we look just at Piedmont in the northwest, this was the name for a large region embracing the eastern slopes of the Maritime Alps, basically running from the mountains along the French border down from west to east to the Po Valley at the bottom. And it straddles the modern-day borders of Italy, France, and Switzerland. It was ruled for many centuries by the House of Savoy, based at their capital in the city of Turin. And the dynasty had for a long time been simply Dukes of Savoy, and their domain was simply called the Duchy of Savoy. But after 1720, they also obtained possession of the Kingdom of Sardinia, based on that island in the sea, and hence they could be called kings, and, naturally, that's what they liked. So this was a very haphazard, agglomerated domain, and Piedmont Sardinia was not necessarily more powerful or wealthy than other states in Italy, but it was well positioned strategically, and hence it would end up becoming a major base and really the nucleus for the creation of the state of Italy. But before we get to that, we should know in the later 1700s, after about 1760 or so, there was a series of efforts at reform in these different states in Italy. So much like in the north, in places like Austria, there was a widespread sense of a need to centralize, to create states with stronger bureaucracies and civil services, capable of mustering resources to support armies, fortifications, and infrastructure. And a lot of these small states and their rulers knew that they were vulnerable because of their small size, their relative poverty. They could end up being invaded and overrun, again, as they had been centuries earlier. So there was the understanding of an urgent need to raise revenue, to levy taxes on major sources of wealth within the country, and hence to revoke the special privileges and immunities of the nobility and the church, who had largely been exempt from taxes. And some of these states did have some limited success, especially in the north, in Milan and in Tuscany. So these were largely compact states centered on major cities, and they were more able to create efficient and professional bureaucracies centered in the capitals. But this project of reform was a lot more difficult to implement in the lands that were more rural and agrarian, especially the Papal States in the middle of Italy and the Kingdom of Naples in the south. And here the rulers' main strategies were to loosen landowners' and tenants' legal claims on their land holdings so that the land could be more easily seized or bought and sold on the market. And the hope was to create an open land market and hence encourage greater agricultural productivity for the commercial market to then grow the economy and create more revenue. So there was an effort to commercialize and to liquidate a lot of these land holdings. And this project of reform was highly controversial. It was generally despised both by the peasant farmers in these countries and by the landowning gentry and nobility, which included also large elements of the church, who were big landholders. And it led to riots and revolts across much of central and southern Italy, further reinforcing this broad sense of decline and breakdown in Italy as compared to the rest of Europe. So this was more or less the situation in Italy when they were suddenly pulled into the great world events of the age and unexpectedly became a major theater of the struggle between great powers and between contending world systems in a time of revolution. So at first, between the 1790s and about the 1820s, the Italian states were basically reduced to pawns and puppets of the great powers to the north, namely France and Austria. But with time, a series of new popular movements arose as well, and a new national spirit was awakened, by which Italians across the peninsula began to see themselves and to assert themselves as a collective, which must act in concert in order to control their own destiny. So specifically, what happened to Italy in the revolutionary period? Well, in 1792, revolutionary France declared war on Austria. And they did fight engagements in sort of the far northeastern corner of France. But it was very difficult. Although the French mustered large armies and had great passion for their cause, it was hard for them to attack Austria directly, since the Alps are in the way, right? Austria is kind of safely ensconced over at the eastern end of the Alps. But the Po Valley and the flatlands of northern Italy happened to present a kind of convenient avenue linking southern France to the southern underbelly of the Austrian Empire. And hence in 1793, the French Revolutionary armies invaded Piedmont in the northwestern part of Italy and occupied the counties of Nice and Savoy on the borders of France and Piedmont. Then in the spring of 1796, they invaded again under the command of the young rising general Napoleon Bonaparte. And they had rapid success. They quickly defeated Piedmont, Sardinia, and moved to engage Austria. They captured the city of Milan, the major city in north-central Italy. And as this was going on, revolutionary ideas were also quickly spreading into Italy. So this was not just an inter-imperial war, it was an ideologically charged war. And many patriot clubs were founded around Italy, modeled basically on the Jacobins in France, and sometimes called Jacobini in Italian. And these clubs of patriots and Jacobini called for unification of Italy as a democratic republic, more or less on the model of revolutionary France. And some began to plot revolutionary uprisings in their own states. Some cities, especially Milan, became centers of a vibrant radical press, and new terms were promoted and entered into the language like nazione or nation, patria, homeland or fatherland, and italianità or Italianness, the sense of a common nationality. Now, these Jacobini and patriot clubs were initially encouraged by the French state, who could see them as potential allies within Italy, but not for very long, right? Events shifted quickly. In the fall of 1796, the French won more victories over the Austrians. In May 1797, the French overthrew and occupied the Republic of Venice. In September 1797, France forced Austria to admit defeat and to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio, according to which France took de facto control over all of Italy. And ironically, by the time France had more or less seized control, de facto control over the whole peninsula, by this time the radical Jacobins were already out of power within France. And so this Jacobin-style movement in Italy ended up being suppressed by the French themselves. And the French apportioned all of Italy into three so-called republics. So in the north, they created the Cisalpine Republic, in the center, the Roman Republic, and in the south, the Neapolitan Republic. And each of these republics had its own constitution, including an elected assembly. But really, in effect, they were run as puppet states of France. And some patriots and former Jacobins were able to gain power and office in these states, but still they were very internally disunited. So these patriots were split between, for one, those who wanted radical reforms to uplift the poor, a sort of proto-socialism, much like one saw in the radical phase of the French Revolution, and on the other hand, those who wanted to stick with more moderate reforms, like had already been pursued earlier in the 18th century in Italy. And moreover, these republican regimes were not broadly popular, including especially in the countryside. They were seen as destabilizing, as anti-religious. They were resented for raising taxes, and they were distrusted because they were dependent on foreign French military support. And this whole system was very short-lived. So in 1799, the Second Coalition, which included Austria and Russia, struck back against the French. They invaded Italy, and there they were able to defeat the French, and these puppet republics quickly collapsed. In some regions, counter-revolutionary peasant armies and mobs invaded the cities, attacked and destroyed these patriot governments. And in doing so, they often invoked religious symbols. In Tuscany, the peasants carried the banner of St. Mary. In Naples, they were led by a cardinal, Cardinal Ruffo, and were called the Army of the Holy Faith. And this counter-revolution was especially brutal in Naples. The peasant army of the Holy Faith sacked the city, arrested 8,000 patriots, accused them of treason, and executed over 100. And this whole counter-revolutionary wave instilled fear among the class of Republicans and reformists, who now were very afraid of the reactionary instincts of the peasantry, and for many years after would try to keep them at bay or out of politics. In 1799 to 1800, some of the old states and principalities were reestablished, basically on the ruins of these short-lived revolutionary republics. In 1801, however, Napoleon struck back, defeated the Second Coalition, and retook control of most of Italy. As of 1805, Napoleon could control basically all of the mainland of Italy, and the only areas not under French control were the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. So the royal houses of Savoy and of Bourbon took refuge on those islands, protected by the British Navy. So now there was a period of Napoleonic imperial control over Italy that lasted longer than the brief revolutionary occupation and had a much deeper impact. So a large section of the country in the northwest, stretching from Piedmont all the way down to Rome, was directly annexed to France, became part of the French Empire. The northeastern area was made into the puppet Kingdom of Italy with its capital at Venice, and the south was made into a Kingdom of Naples, and Napoleon placed family members of his own as viceroys on the thrones at Venice and Naples. This French Bonapartist regime lasted until Napoleon fell from power in 1814 and collapsed. They all had collapsed by the end of 1815, but still that was plenty of time for this Napoleonic occupation to have a very deep impact, much deeper and greater than that of the revolutionary interim. For one thing, it showed the severe weakness of the old regimes, which were easily swept aside. It eliminated most of the borders that had divided up Italy, and it allowed for extensive travel and trade and communication all across the peninsula. It allowed for the beginning of the creation of a national market economy all across Italy. And these two kingdoms in the northeast and the south enacted centralized, standardized fiscal and tax systems, much increasing state revenue. They abolished the temporal powers of the Pope and the Church, seized and sold off a great deal of church property, enacted a standard secular law code, which for one thing abolished restrictions on the Jews. They created a basic public education system, enacted military conscription, and created new state enforcement arms, including a police force, which in French was called a gendarmerie, and then in Italian came to be known as carabinieri, basically the riflemen or gunmen. And they again were highly controversial. These regimes were very much disliked among the traditional upper classes, who lost power and control of offices. They were disliked by the church, which lost their legal powers and a lot of their property. They were mostly disliked in the rural societies, both the peasantry and the gentry. They especially hated the military conscription, and this sparked a lot of resistance, right? Conscription, draft riots, as often happens. And in the south, a large rebellion broke out in 1806, led by a sort of renegade military officer called Fra Diavolo. That was, Brother Devil. That was kind of his moniker. And it lasted for 2 years, and then many smaller outbreaks of peasant resistance and banditry continued through 1811. But at the same time, these Napoleonic regimes were very much liked among the urban middle classes, especially the so-called new men. These were middle-class, literate men from commoner or minor noble families who were able to break into government and military offices for the first time and often get promotion according to talent and performance, which was an important pillar of Napoleonic policy all throughout Napoleon's empire. And these new men formed then an enduring core of a reformist movement that lasted all through the rest of the century. So all in all, this Napoleonic period led to great continuing divides and tensions. Urban versus rural, middle class versus the other classes, right, the peasantry and the traditional noble classes, secular versus religious, and north versus south. Right, there was a much greater constituency and greater embrace of this Napoleonic transformation in the north than in the south. Now, as we know, Napoleon's invasion of Russia was a catastrophic failure. He fell from power first in 1814 and then again in 1815. And during this time, the Congress of Vienna sought to restore the political order in Europe and the balance of power, both internal and external, right? Both among the classes within traditional states and among the powers of Europe. And as part of this process, the Congress assigned all of Italy to Austria as their sphere of influence. And there were two main reasons they did so, right? One, partly to act as a sort of steward to ensure the restoration of the old order in Italy. The Congress wanted to basically turn back the clock of all this social and political upheaval in Italy, just as in everywhere else in Europe. And secondly, also partly so that Austria could use Italy as a kind of forward buffer zone against any future threat from a resurgent France. Right, so this kind of assignment of Austria as the suzerain of Italy was strategic as well as ideological. And specifically, Metternich, the real sort of power behind the throne in Austria, is quoted as saying, "It is on the river Po that we defend the Rhine." It's a sort of variation of we fight them over there so we don't have to fight them over here, right? If we have a military presence on the ground in Italy, then we don't have to worry about a direct French attack on Germany or Austria. And also, this new arrangement had a further ramification, which was maybe not as intentional, but in effect, Austria replaced France as the defender of the papacy, right? So France had this long history and tradition of putting themselves forward as the allies and protectors of the papacy, going all the way back to Charlemagne, right? Charlemagne protecting the Pope against the Lombards, and the Pope in turn crowning Charlemagne as emperor. Well, now France, because of the revolution mainly, had given up that role, and it was now effectively assumed that mantle was taken up now by Austria. So in the aftermath of the Congress of Vienna, Austria outright annexed Veneto and Lombardy, right? So these big, valuable, rich regions in the northeast and north central Italy. As for the rest of Italy, the Austrians, like the French had before, they too divided Italy into three basic zones, north, center, and south. But they governed them differently through more sort of indirect arrangements. So in the north, the duchies like Tuscany, Modena, and Parma were restored, but Habsburg relatives of the Austrian emperor were placed onto the thrones, and hence they became basically little satellite states of Austria. In the center, the papal states were recreated and the Pope placed back on the throne. And in the south, the Kingdom of Naples was restored with the Bourbon King Ferdinando IV on the throne. And now, Ferdinando in the south administratively unified the kingdom, right? He revoked Sicily's traditional autonomy, and he called this new unified absolutist state the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. And, there's a weird, crazy constitutional history for why it got that weird name. But basically, he's trying to create a more absolutist, centralized state in the south. So you have the papal states in the middle of Italy and this new Kingdom of Two Sicilies in the south. So in the papal states in the south, these were not ruled directly by Habsburgs, like those small duchies in the north, but both states had to agree to house garrisons of Austrian troops to maintain order and ostensibly to protect them. So really, in effect, these were Austrian protectorates. So all in all, effectively, Italy was an Austrian-controlled bloc. The one exception that stood out was Sardinia-Piedmont. This is the one kingdom in Italy that was actually left independent in order to serve as a buffer zone between the Austrian sphere to the east and France to the west. Right? So this would help to, tamp down any possible tensions or avoid confrontation directly between Austria and France. And Austria was willing to allow Sardinia-Piedmont to have this actual independence because they saw it as too minor to really be a threat to them. And they even enlarged it by adding the Republic of Genoa onto their territories. So this was a sort of vote of confidence that a strong Sardinia-Piedmont would serve conveniently as a buffer. Now, this would end up backfiring. It would turn out that the Austrians underestimated Sardinia-Piedmont. So I want to look back for a minute here and understand kind of the history and the dynamics of Sardinia-Piedmont, which would come into play. So this kingdom had medieval roots originally in the small county of Savoy on the southern shores of Lake Geneva, in an area that today is part of France, and we'll find out why that is. And the local noble ruling family in the county of Savoy gradually grew and extended their domains, especially southward into Italy and Provence, mainly through strategic marriage alliances. And you can see this is very similar to the Habsburgs, right? Remember in my lecture a long time ago about Central Europe, I spoke about how the Habsburgs started out as just counts of a little small fiefdom in Switzerland. And through alliances and through marriages, they became the great ruling dynasty of Central Europe. Well, the House of Savoy is kind of like a smaller analog to that. And they also built up their domains, and they made a strategic alliance with the Habsburgs. Maybe they felt a sort of affinity with them, which then brought them kind of into the greater power politics of Central Europe. And they were able to further obtain more important counties. Most importantly, in 1388, they obtained the county of Nice, or as it was also called Nizza, which gave them then an outlet to the sea. So now they have this domain running all the way from the mountains to the seacoast. In 1416, the Holy Roman Empire elevated them to dukes, right? So this now, what was the county of Savoy was now the Duchy of Savoy, and they set up their capital at Chambéry in what's now France. After 1500, they expanded more aggressively southward and eastward into Italy. And in the mid-1500s, the Duke Emmanuel Philibert fought alongside the Habsburgs against France, allowing them to gain more important territory. In 1563, they acquired the city of Turin, further down in what you can basically call the Upper Po Valley. And they soon moved their capital there. So they're now becoming really an Italian-based power. In the 1600s, they also built up Nice into a major seaport. In the early 1700s, they took part in the War of the Spanish Succession, and they supported the Austrian Habsburg side. So a few years later, in 1720, as part of a sort of diplomatic reward for supporting the Habsburgs in that war, they were given the crown of Sardinia. So Sardinia is that island in the Mediterranean that was strategically located and had been a sort of commercial center at one time, but by this time was generally poor, with its capital at the small city of Cagliari. And the ruling house of Savoy, the big benefit they got from this really was now they could be called royal, right? They had gotten a royal crown, but they continued to be based at Turin on the mainland, and really most of their attention was on Piedmont. So there's a case here of sort of the tail wagging the dog, and hence the name confusion, right? Technically, they were kings of Sardinia, and the technical name of their domain was Kingdom of Sardinia. But it was more often actually called Piedmont Sardinia, or Sardinia Piedmont, or even just Piedmont, right? But that's where that confusion comes from. In the 1740s, they took part in the War of the Austrian Succession, and now for the first time they turned against the Habsburgs. And this reflects perhaps their ambitions turning more and more to the east, towards the fertile lands of the Po Valley and the Lombard Plain. And they were able to gain some parts of the Duchy of Milan from the Austrians, and now continue to expand down into the Po Valley. So by 1750, Piedmont was now one of the three major states in Italy, alongside the Kingdom of Naples in the south and the Papal States in the center. And it was by this point even larger than the Venetian Republic or the Grand Duchy of Tuscany. In 1792, they joined into the coalition against the French Revolutionary Republic, but as we heard, they were quickly beaten by the French under Napoleon. In 1796, they were forced to allow the free passage of the French armies through their territory. In 1798, the French occupied Turin and seized control of all of Piedmont, and the kings were forced to withdraw then to Sardinia. In 1814, the Congress of Vienna initially restored the kingdom, including both Piedmont and Sardinia, and as we said, added on the Republic of Genoa. And this was partly a reward for having fought against the French, right, joined the coalition, but also it made them into a convenient buffer state between Austria and France, right, creating a sort of cordon sanitaire all the way from the mountains to the sea. So overall, if we look from 1815 onward, these restoration governments, right, not just Piedmont, Sardinia, but the duchies, the Austrian regime in the north, the Papal States, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, these restoration governments wanted to restore order and stability, but they also didn't just want to turn back the clock, even if perhaps that's what the Congress of Vienna had hoped. They also still saw the need to continue the reforms that had started in the 1700s to try to create centralized states, raise revenue, form modern armies, and they had to deal with similar resistance and unrest, including among the peasantry. So there was always still change and instability all through this restoration era. And the restoration governments also, more specifically, they had to decide what to do with the contending classes that had kind of been unleashed into politics and who all wanted a share in government and in power. So they had to decide, should they retain the new men that had risen to control the armies and the state bureaucracies during the Napoleonic period, or should they throw them out and bring back the old noble and ecclesiastical elites? And different states basically tried out different sorts of compromises, right? How much reshuffling to do. But they all ended up angering somebody, right? There was no way to satisfy everyone. In the countryside, many old nobles were furious at not regaining all of their lost powers and privileges. And in the cities, many middle-class men were angry at being thrown out and replaced. And further, much of these angry men in the cities were now idle and unemployed, and hence especially dangerous. And many of them began to join and to swell the ranks of underground conspiratorial movements, which centered largely on initiatory secret societies that had been kind of spun off from Freemasonry, such as the so-called Adelphia, which was led by an ex-Jacobin named Buonarroti. But the most important of these underground secret societies was the so-called Carboneria, which had actually started in around 1810 or so. We don't know all the details, but around 1810 in Naples, while Naples was under Napoleonic rule. And the members of this society were called Carbonari, which originally means charcoal burners or charcoal sellers. And it seems as if this group based their symbols and rituals on the trade of charcoal selling, much as, Freemasons borrowed the symbols and rituals of actual stonemasons. Well, the Carbonari, it seems, saw charcoal selling as this sort of special activity where you were itinerant, you had contact with different people, it could be secretive. And this is how they sort of modeled themselves. And members would go through an initiation process. They were often recruited from the Masons, right? This is one of these many groups that the Masons could feed right into. And they swore an oath where they pledged to fight for a constitution for the Kingdom of Naples. And again, like with the Jacobins, early on, the Carbonari were encouraged by foreign allies, by the British and the Austrians, who again could see them as allies against the French. They then welcomed the collapse of the Bonapartist regime, and at least in Naples, which was their main base, they tried to institute a constitution for the Kingdom of Naples. But they were then blocked by Austria and Austria's puppets. So this broke that early alliance between the Austrians and the Carbonari, and they now went their own way, and even turned against their Austrian allies when they saw Austria restoring conservative and even reactionary regimes all over Italy. So after 1815, they grew massively and spread all over the peninsula, and they attracted some liberal reformists that had been shut out of power even in Piedmont, as well as in Milan and Tuscany. But the biggest group by far was still in Naples and in the Papal States, because these were the most reactionary and repressive regimes in this Restoration era. And the Carbonari became a vehicle for opposition to Austria, aspirations for Italian unity, and opposition to absolute monarchy, and demands for a constitution or even for a democratic republic in Italy. And they attracted many disaffected middle-class men, minor officials, and army officers, so there was infiltration here into the officer corps, and also some peasants and priests, too, though these were not their main base. They also gained power with the popular discontent that grew from famines and food shortages in 1817, and so this made possible then the idea of launching a broad popular revolution, basically plotted and led by the Carbonari. And this actually happened in 1820. So Carbonari and friendly army officers together launched a revolt in Naples. They forced the King Ferdinando to grant a constitution, and the uprising then spread to Sicily, especially in Palermo. And in Sicily, the uprising also had conservative elements. It got a certain degree of support from the rural nobility who wanted to regain their autonomy from Naples, and also from artisans who wanted to restore their old guild privileges and powers. So it was bringing in different constituencies. In 1821, the unrest then spread dramatically into the north, with plots by army officers and other Carbonari. In Piedmont, the army officers seized power in a coup and instituted a constitution, and they declared their aims to seize Lombardy from Austria and to launch an Italian confederation. And these 1820 to 21 revolutions can be seen in a lot of ways to prefigure 1848, including in how they failed. So there were important divisions among the revolutionaries, including between moderate liberals who wanted constitutional reform and radical Democrats who wanted to overthrow the monarchs and declare a republic. And there was infighting over whether to abolish the monarchies and over whether to allow the propertyless masses, right, of workers and peasants to vote or enter politics. Also, some of these more conservative classes that had joined in as well, such as the local nobility in Sicily, got scared by the scale of popular unrest and discontent among the peasantry and backed out. So pretty soon, the local monarchies and the Austrian backers were able to strike back and restore the old order. And this took a lot of time and bloodshed, mainly in the south, where the elites were very fragmented. Whereas the restoration was comparatively faster and smoother in Piedmont. So in Piedmont, both liberal and conservative leaders agreed on the need to maintain order and stability, and they came together to suppress popular unrest and shore up the monarchy. And a broad reaction set in across Italy after 1821, and this underground resistance still persisted, but there was censorship, repression, and infiltration into the secret societies, especially by Austrian agents. And the next 10 years or so were basically quiescent. So as I said, the secret societies persisted, and they continued to take their inspiration from France. And it happens that the Carbonari even spread into France. There were cells in Paris and other cities, Marseille. And in 1830, the revolution in France that overthrew the Bourbon monarchy, this helped to then inspire and trigger another revolutionary wave in Italy. Right? So just like in the Atlantic, these revolutionary forces are bouncing, flowing back and forth across borders. So in 1831, there's another revolutionary wave. There are revolts in the central Italian duchies and in the Papal States. These then failed in basically a similar manner to in 1821. The Carbonari and the old Jacobin Filippo Buonarroti played some role in planning and leading these revolutions, especially in the duchies. In Modena, the Carbonari initially persuaded the Duke to support their uprising and to embrace a constitution and to call for unification of Italy, and they persuaded him to take up the symbolic title of King of Italy. But soon after, he reneged, and he was convinced by the Austrians to arrest and execute the Carbonari leader. So this was sort of the last hurrah for the Carboneria. After this, they faded into irrelevance, and Buonarroti too was finally discredited, and now that Jacobin legacy was basically wiped out. The Austrians suppressed the revolutionary governments and restored the monarchs. And basically, you can say in retrospect, all players lost in 1831. All parties came out embarrassed. So the old monarchies were embarrassed due to their obvious weakness and lack of public support. Austria, because they failed to maintain the stability and protect the papacy. This then led France to step in again and basically try to reassert their role as protectors of the Pope. And they were able to place a military garrison in Ancona, a port city on the Adriatic, which was part of the Papal States, but which had a lot of connections to the outside world. It had a radical wing. There was a lot of resistance there. And this then reopened the long rivalry between France and Austria, and they had to compete for who got sort of the prestige of being the protector of the Pope. Also, the moderate liberals were humiliated due to their timidity and indecisiveness, often dithering between the reactionary and revolutionary sides. And the radical Democrats were embarrassed due to their disorganization and impetuousness, which led to pretty quick failure. So after 1831, it was clear that the sort of Carbonari revolutionary project had definitely failed. One thing that they did at least gain was a set of martyr heroes, such as the Carbonari leader in Modena, Ciro Menotti, who, as I mentioned, was betrayed and executed by the Duke of Modena. So they started to build up a sort of revolutionary martyr mythology, as often happens in a lot of radical movements. And the idea of revolution and unification still remained. But the great obstacles now had to be faced in a more serious way. And the fundamentally shallow base of the revolutionary movement clearly had to be deepened if it was going to have any chance of success. So this dilemma then set the stage for the so-called Risorgimento. So this word, to begin with, Risorgimento, it literally means resurgence, but in the Italian of the 19th century, it meant something more broadly like revival or even resurrection. And as we'll see, there is a kind of religious overtone to it. So this was the word used for a movement that was not just a political movement based on constitutionalism and unification like the earlier liberal reform movements, but that was conceived as a social awakening, including in the spheres of art and culture as well as political reform. And it was centered on the basic narrative, the basic myth, you could say, that Italy had once been great and had now fallen into a state of poverty, weakness, and foreign control due to internal corruption and especially lack of patriotic spirit. And so now the nation had to be revived or resurrected. And it was not clear, of course, as in these sorts of myths, it was not clear exactly when was the golden era that Italy had to return to. Were they speaking of the Roman era or the Renaissance? Anytime you looked, there was some degree of corruption, decadence, or disunity. And, the Romans didn't primarily think or talk of themselves as Italians, right? And same in the Renaissance. People believed they were Florentines or Venetians, right? So in a lot of ways, you couldn't map this new Italian identity that people were trying to construct onto any moment in the past. But, this is nationalism. You can't let that stop you. And regardless, the point was to regain the so-called primacy of Italy as a center of civilization, and as part of that, to liberate and unleash the talents and energies of the Italian people. So this was very much a populist and organicist movement, a classic example of romantic nationalism, right? There's this sort of organically unified people and a spirit that must assert itself on the world stage. And you could say this is possibly the paradigmatic example of romantic nationalism. But at the same time, this divide did not go away. There were really two risorgimentos, or risorgimenti, you could say properly. There was a radical democratic movement which envisioned a unitary republic with its capital at Rome, and a liberal reformist wing of the movement, which sought to work with the existing governments in order to consolidate the country, and still believed unification could be achieved by negotiation and moral suasion. And these two sides of the Risorgimento could sometimes overlap or cooperate, but the alliance was still quite tenuous and fragile. In the aftermath of the failed 1831 revolutions, the young revolutionary leaders fled abroad, and these included, it would turn out, most importantly, these included among them a young revolutionary named Giuseppe Mazzini, who had been born in Genoa, was the son of an academic who had Jacobin sympathies. He had joined the Carbonari in 1827 at the age of 22, and he was arrested and imprisoned for a time, so he knew the serious repression that the movement faced. He was trained as a lawyer and then became a radical journalist and propagandist. Now, after 1831, he fled to Marseille in France, and there he founded a new fraternal group, not as secretive and underground, more licit, which was called Giovine Italia, or Young Italy. And this new organization was reserved only for men under 40, right? So it was very conscious of a generational change. It rejected the old dependence on France and the French Revolution, right? So he wanted to distinguish Young Italy from the old Jacobin and Patriot clubs, which in his view were too foreign, too modeled on France. He called for a distinctly Italian movement aimed at unification above all else, and directed at the papacy as enemy number one, right? The main opponent right there in the heart of Italy. And the movement in a lot of ways was quasi-mystical. The sort of slogan was Dio e popolo, God and the people. And, Mazzini argued that sovereignty, real legitimate sovereignty, sprang in an almost metaphysical way from God and the people at once, who in some ways were kind of equated as one thing. And the movement put forward, you could say, a sort of new religion of the nation in place of traditional Catholicism, which then appealed to these constituencies that were anti-clerical, skeptical of the church and the Pope. After Marseille, Mazzini then sojourned in various different parts of Europe, Switzerland, England. He became the main ringleader of the Italian exiles, and even of Republican radicals and dissidents in general. Right? So he was the visionary, you could say. He put himself forward as the visionary of revolutionary Europe, although he was not an actual fighter. He saw the liberation of the nation as part of a general liberation of mankind, like the emancipation of women, serfs, and slaves. But also he drew on romantic and emotional attachments to the past and to the life ways of the folk. Right? So although he rejected clericalism and church power, he did still believe that there was this kind of deep history and folk way of the people. And he became known as an intellectual and a kind of personification of Italy, and specifically of modern Italy as a symbol of all oppressed humanity. Right? So you get to square the circle, right? Italy is this special, unique, organically unified nation, but at the same time it represents all of humankind aspiring towards liberation. Now, as I said, he was not actually a fighter, right? He was a speaker, a writer, an organizer. Instead, the fighter was Giuseppe Garibaldi, right? So where Mazzini was the dreamer, Garibaldi was the fighter. And Garibaldi was another young revolutionary who had been born in Nice, right, in that city that was part of the Duchy of Savoy, right, but and was largely Italian-speaking. We now think of it as part of France. But regardless, he was from Nice. He had also joined the revolutionary movement, and he led the actual armed uprising in Genoa in 1831. And arguably, he was the only military leader in that revolution who acquitted himself pretty well. He was nonetheless captured and then escaped. In 1836, he went to Uruguay and helped to fight for independence from Spain in South America. And Mazzini basically used his own fame to hype up Garibaldi and to make him into a symbol of the Italian revival as part of the international revolutionary movement, right? And Garibaldi, you know, he could handle a gun, he was good looking, he had more of, you could say, this sort of masculine swagger that the movement wanted. And it happens both Mazzini and Garibaldi were Freemasons, and this helped them to plug into sort of international intellectual and political networks. And they also took advantage of media, like newspapers and pamphlets, to become sort of international celebrities. And with them as figureheads, young Italy grew quickly. In 1833, Mazzini and Garibaldi plotted a revolt in Piedmont, based among the Young Italy groups in Turin and Genoa, but it was discovered and quashed, and Young Italy was devastated within Piedmont. Mazzini then went to Switzerland, and then in 1837 to London. And here he found a new sort of international audience. He gained a great degree of sympathy, including among reformists and radicals in England. He was able to raise money, and he started rebuilding Young Italy with this new base in Northern Europe, and also with a branch specifically for workers. So, you know, as industry is booming, there's this increasing sort of radicalism and solidarity among industrial workers and their allies. And Mazzini starts to enfold that, too, into this Italian movement. The Risorgimento also influenced art, literature, and music, which in turn provided new symbols, drawing on romantic sentiment. Perhaps the most famous and lasting example of this came in 1841. So the young composer Giuseppe Verdi, who'd been born in a small village near Parma, in this point in the early 1840s, he was in a period of deep depression following the death of his wife and commercial failures of his early operas. But he was sent a libretto of an opera which was about the Assyrian emperor Nebuchadnezzar, who appears, as you may know, as a villain in the Hebrew Bible, right? An oppressor of the Israelites. And this libretto had been written by an even younger librettist, Temistocles Solera, and the content was very odd. It was kind of a reworked mashup of different stories about the ancient Israelite kingdom and their trials and tribulations. And Verdi was reluctant to even look at it, but he was struck by particular passages, and so he worked through his depression, was able to complete this opera, which was titled Nabucco, the shortened Italian name, and it premiered at La Scala in Milan in 1842, and it was a huge hit. And the most famous piece by far is the choral song Va Pensiero, which is partly inspired by Psalm 137, which is a lament of the Babylonian captivity, right? So the speaker is putatively one of the Hebrews who'd been sent into exile in Babylon and is singing about the longing for Zion, the homeland. And so there's a dramatic scene in Nabucco where we see revealed a massive chorus where Israelites in exile in Babylon appear clothed in rags, apparently taking a brief rest from their work, and they begin to sing in unison about their longing for their homeland, to which they can only return in their imaginations. And the song contains the lines, "O mia patria, si bella e perduta. O membranza, si cara e fatal. O my homeland, so beautiful and so lost. O memories so dear and so deadly." And this song can be taken, and was taken at the time, as a metaphor for the longing for a free and united Italy, which can only be conjured up in the collective imagination. And so a lot of that sentiment you can see summed up in Solera's lyrics, right, which had to be set in ancient biblical times, so it wasn't too obviously a political comment on Italy and the Austrian domination of Italy. But it's also very significant how Verdi set the words to music. The chorus has various voice parts, right, of both sexes, all ages, different vocal ranges, yet they all sing in unison. There is no polyphonic harmonization, no counterpoint. It is in the style, in a way, of ancient choral chant, right? That might be what the Psalms originally sounded like when they were chanted. But also it can be seen as embodying a united people, thinking, speaking as one. And the song was quickly adopted as a kind of unofficial anthem of Italy and of the Risorgimento. And this song and the experience of singing it together in marches, in rallies, on barricades, this became, you could say, constitutive of the nation, which still existed in the collective imagination and aspiration. So this was sort of the rising atmosphere in the 1840s, and the following year after Nabucco premiered, in 1843, young Italy launched a revolt in Bologna, a university city in the northern Papal States, but it quickly failed. In 1844, two Italian brothers who were serving in the Austrian Navy created a plot to seize an Austrian ship and bombard Messina in Sicily in hopes of touching off a revolution, right? As it happened before, right? Unrest sometimes began in Sicily. This didn't work, and they then heard rumors of unrest in Calabria on the mainland, and they gathered a small team, an expeditionary team of just 20 men, landed on the shore in Calabria, expecting the people to rally to them and start an uprising. The notion was that they could use the South as a base for a national revolution, with the aim of creating a, quote, independent, united, and democratic Italian republic with Rome as its capital. But no uprising happened, right? This is what happens sometimes. Revolutionaries get way ahead of themselves. The local people were not interested, mainly assumed that they were pirates, and they were quickly arrested and executed. And again, these Bandiera brothers basically served as another abject failure that at least produced martyrs. But these setbacks were very embarrassing for the Young Italy movement, and it compounded then a loss of ideological initiative. So after 1840, and especially by the failure of these Bandiera brothers in 1844, a shift was happening where Mazzini and Young Italy were more and more challenged within Italy by a growing moderate liberal camp. And this included a lot of artists, scientists, and historians who had been relatively apolitical, but who started to organize in order to oppose what they saw as the dangerous and unrealistic radicalism of Mazzini and Giovine Italia. And they started a propaganda campaign of their own. Books were published to present the liberal case to a wide public audience, and the most popular of them was written by Vincenzo Gioberti, and it was called Del primato morale e civile degli Italiani, or the moral and civil primacy of the Italians. And this was a sensation, a bestseller. It was very nationalistic. It emphasized a national destiny over and above the political principles of democracy or equality, and it argued instead for a confederation of Italian states led by the Pope as suzerain or president. And this idea gained a lot of traction, especially among reformists and educated people in the cities, and it came to be called neo-Guelphism. Right? So invoking that much older medieval feud between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. Right? So those were the two main sort of political factions that contended for power in northern Italy back in the 1300s. And you had the Ghibellines, who supported the authority of the Holy Roman Empire, saw themselves as subjects of this greater empire, versus supporters of the Pope, right? The Guelphs were partisans of the Pope, who saw the Pope as a sponsor and protector of these small Italian states and cities, and a protector of their independence as against the empire. So people observed it was curious that these liberal reformists now in the 1840s were kind of taking up that same project again and trying to cast the Pope again as this sort of leader of a patchwork Italy of small independent states. So the moderate liberals now finally had a dynamic political vision and program of their own that could compete with the radicals' idea of a democratic republic and could sort of take the mantle of nationalism from the radicals. In 1846, the papal conclave in Rome elected a new pope who took the title of Pius IX. And Pius IX was relatively young. He was only 54, so quite young, and he was himself understood to be a liberal reformist. As a bishop, he had obtained pardons for revolutionaries who took part in the revolutions in 1831. He had supported administrative reforms in the Papal States, and he had expressed some sympathy for the national movement. So this encouraged hopes then that he might fulfill this role for the Neo-Guelphs and might oversee the process of confederation in Italy. So by that time, liberal reformism's star was clearly rising. And in 1847, the rulers of Piedmont and Tuscany embraced some liberal reforms and joined together with the Pope to form a customs union. Right? So now three major states, Piedmont, Tuscany, and the Papal States, are part of one customs. There's free movement of people and goods across those borders. And this promised to possibly be the beginning of a confederation, similar to what one had already seen in Germany, where the Zollverein, or customs union joining most of northern and central Germany, kind of paved the way for the gradual political integration of Germany. And even in more repressive states like the Austrian provinces, the liberal press and associations grew and could spread ideas to compete with or even eclipse Mazzini's radical republicanism. However, at the same time, there was a deepening economic crisis and food shortages all across Europe, including in Italy, and this fell very hard on the impoverished rural areas of southern Italy, and it led to bread riots and protests that threatened to possibly escalate. And that is exactly what happened when in January 1848, bread riots in Palermo did explode into a large-scale rebellion, which then overcame the army and seized control of the city. And this Palermo uprising was like a match to dry kindling. The news was carried by rails and telegraphs, this growing mass communication and transport system. It was brought all through Italy and into the rest of Europe. Within weeks, marches, riots, and revolts were breaking out all over Italy and other countries to the north. In February 1848, King Louis-Philippe of France fled the country. In March, Metternich, the real ruler of Austria, had to flee from Vienna. Within Italy, the radicals capitalized on this unrest. They mobilized the urban poor and artisans. Frightened rulers quickly handed out new constitutions, including in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Papal States, Tuscany, and Piedmont. In March, uprisings were able to seize control of most of the Austrian domains in the north. They threw the Austrian troops out of Milan. In Venice, rioters broke the dissident leader Daniele Manin out of prison and put him at the head of a restored Republic of St. Mark. Meanwhile, at the same time in March, Piedmont Sardinia harnessed this nationalist revolutionary fervor by declaring war on Austria. And this then created a sort of rage militaire, where a lot of this popular passion was channeled into recruiting volunteer armies, which formed in the Papal States and the Kingdom of Naples, and went north to join with the Piedmontese. And together they were able to successfully capture and control Milan and most of Lombardy. In April, Mazzini returned to Italy and made a triumphant entry into Milan. And like in all of Europe, the revolutionaries seemed to have astonishing early success in 1848. But this early success proved to be illusory and short-lived. So by this point, by 1848, the conservatives and the restoration regimes were now pretty experienced in dealing with revolutions. They knew how these things played out. So in the internal political arena, the granting of constitutions served to split the revolutionary coalition. It satisfied most of the moderate liberals, who were able to take power in these state organs. They then sought to wind down. Once these liberal reformists, had their constitutional regimes and parliaments like they wanted, they then sought to wind down the revolutions and to contain the revolting masses and the radicals. The reactionaries then could simply sit back and wait for the revolutionaries to fragment. Meanwhile, in the war with Austria, so in foreign and military affairs, this mass mobilization of men from all over Italy, including from the Papal States, alarmed Pope Pius IX. Although he'd been seen as a liberal and even something of a nationalist, he saw this as going way too far. He was disturbed by this mass of Catholic men arming and going to war against another Catholic power and protector of the papacy, which was Austria. And presumably, he probably realized that he might be next himself and could wind up being the last pope. So he did an about-face, and from that point basically became a reactionary. And firstly, he ordered all the volunteers to return home to the Papal States and to Naples. He declared neutrality in the war against Austria. And then in May, King Ferdinando of the Two Sicilies overthrew the liberal constitutional government in a coup, shut down the parliament, and ordered his armies back to Naples. So now the Piedmontese were left high and dry, right? This massive foreign and volunteer force that had come to their aid was gone. And in July, they suffered their first major loss to the Austrians. They had to abandon Milan and retreat back into the borders of Piedmont. And all in all, the events of the spring and summer were a crushing humiliation for the moderate liberals. They were suddenly abandoned and betrayed by those same monarchs in which they had placed a great degree of trust and hope. They now lost control of the situation, right? So on the one hand, they had underestimated the reactionaries, who now more or less stabbed them in the back. And also, these urban liberals really did not know or care about the countryside. They sought to suppress rural unrest, and they also used their new powers in these liberal regimes to raise taxes and to levy conscription demands on the peasantry. So this infuriated the peasantry at large. In the summer, peasants and landholders together turned against these new constitutional governments, and in many places they welcomed Austrian armies back into their lands, helping them to suppress the revolution and restore the old order. So with these liberal regimes suddenly failing and collapsing, the radical Democrats now sought to seize the initiative back into their own hands. And this is distinctive to Italy, right? This story of fragmentation and reaction, this was played out many times over all around Europe, especially, in Prussia and in Austria. But only in Italy did the 1848 revolutions experience a second, more radical phase, which continued on for more than a year. Mazzini issued an appeal to the Italians, saying, for one thing, that the war between kings was now over, but the war of the people had just begun. And Daniele Manin from Venice remained in control of this restored republic in Venice. In Rome, radicals assassinated the Pope's prime minister. The Pope fled to the fortress of Gaeta on the coast south of Rome. The revolutionaries seized control of the city. Mazzini then arrived there in Rome in February 1849, and proclaimed a republic led by a so-called triumvirate of himself and two other radicals. This Roman Republic instituted universal male suffrage, they seized control of the education system from the church, and they seized church lands and redistributed them among the peasantry. Meanwhile, in Florence, the capital of Tuscany, the Grand Duke also fled, and revolutionaries there founded another democratic republic and instituted similar reforms to what was seen in Rome. So this was a really dramatic advance and intensification of the revolutionary movement. But still, none of these revolutionary republics was very widely popular among the peasantry. Even though there was land redistribution around Rome, nonetheless, none of these republics had the sort of men, money, or resources to effectively control the countryside or to face off against a major army in battle. In April 1849, the Austrians finally decisively defeated Piedmont, and the whole peninsula now was left exposed to Austrian invasion. The king of Piedmont's Sardinia surrendered to the Austrians and abdicated the throne, and the throne then passed to his younger son, the Prince Victor Emmanuel II, or Vittorio Emanuele. The city of Genoa nonetheless rebelled against this new king and this surrender to the Austrians. They wanted to fight on. Also, the smaller city of Brescia rebelled, and various groups of peasant rebels and brigands went on the warpath, but all were gradually crushed by the Austrians. Austria then attacked Tuscany. They bombarded the city of Livorno on the coast, and they reinstalled the Grand Duke on the throne in Florence. In the south, King Ferdinando retook control of rebel-held Sicily and finally recaptured Palermo, where this whole outbreak had begun in May 1849. So as of this point in May 1849, the only cities still in revolutionary hands were Rome and Venice. And in the same month, France, under the new president Louis Napoleon, went through their own kind of post-revolutionary reaction, right? Leo Napoleon was elected president there, but he was really a conservative. And Louis Napoleon then reassumed the old mantle of protector of the Pope. And he sent in a large French army to attack the Roman Republic in order to restore the church and the papacy to power. The French besieged the city, and the revolutionaries, under Garibaldi as their military commander, were able to hold out for 2 months before capitulating. And thenceforward the French garrisoned armies at Rome in order to protect and prop up the Pope. Garibaldi then took his remaining troops northward to try to help defend Venice, which was now the last holdout rebel republic. The Austrians besieged and bombarded Venice until in August the republic was forced to surrender. So by the end of the summer, the revolution was effectively defeated and the old regimes restored throughout Italy. So one could suppose that this seemed to be, the end of this whole movement, but it did not end here. Right, the movement for unification continued to adapt. And although, the idea of a revolutionary republic now seemed more impossible than ever, the dream of unification continued. So there followed, after 1849, about 10 years of crackdown and repression through almost all the major states of Italy, including in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, the Papal States, Tuscany, and of course the Austrian provinces. The governments enforced strict censorship and surveillance and imprisoned dissidents. Mazzini went abroad again to London, and there he created a new National Italian Committee to recruit and raise money to support more uprisings in Italy. So Mazzini and his committee contributed to failed attempts at revolts in Milan, the Papal States, and Sicily, and this culminated with another delusional attempt to launch a revolution in Campania in the south in 1857. And by that time already, Mazzini was seen as basically discredited, right? His sort of romantic movement was a failure, and people turned elsewhere for new leadership. So there was a widespread sense that a new movement was needed that would be more pragmatic, hard-nosed, and realistic, which would be ready to do the sort of dirty work of unification and to avoid the naive blunders of both the liberals and the radical Democrats, who had all really embarrassed themselves. And it was understood that this would necessarily involve working with a state with a serious army, a treasury, and international standing in order to lead the unification. So in 1857, Daniele Manin and two other revolutionaries formed an Italian National Society, basically aimed at displacing Mazzini's committee and shepherding the nationalist movement away from democratic revolutionism and towards a strategic alliance with the one state in Italy that could plausibly serve as a base for unification under a constitutional order, which was, of course, Sardinia-Piedmont. So Sardinia-Piedmont was the one big exception to the repressive crackdown of the 1850s. They had a liberal constitution, which had been further expanded in the revolution in 1848, which then remained in place through the 1850s, and it maintained a basic freedom of the press and of assembly. The king and the church still had serious powers, right? The church was not totally disestablished, and there was a monarch, but it also did have a parliament that allowed for open debate, and many exiles from the rest of Italy, from these failed revolutions, then went and took shelter in Piedmont, thus further bolstering the atmosphere of freedom and liberal aspiration. And by this time, the prime minister of Sardinia-Piedmont was a man named Camillo Benso di Cavour, who turned out to be one of really the major figures of the 19th century and one of the great political talents, you could say, of all time. So Camillo Benso, the Count of Cavour, had been born in Turin, the capital of Piedmont, in 1810 during the Napoleonic period. And his father was a minor nobleman who had gained wealth and power and estates by allying with Napoleon and his regime. And in fact, he was even personally close with Napoleon and his family, and Camillo's godmother was Napoleon's sister, Pauline. When he was growing up, Camillo was trained in engineering. He managed the family estates and brought in modern agricultural techniques. He also spent a lot of time abroad in France and England. He read French and English philosophers, especially liberal thinkers. He admired the English parliamentary political system and its capacity for gradual reform, and he particularly was an admirer of the British Prime Minister Robert Peel, whom he saw as skillfully steering a middle course between radicalism and reaction. So he valued this sort of compromise course that maintained stability. In the 1840s, he got involved in politics back in Piedmont, and he started a liberal newspaper called Il Risorgimento, and was one of the popularizers of that phrase. In 1849, during the revolution, he was elected to the parliament and then was soon brought into the cabinet. And just a few years later, in 1853, he plotted and ousted the prime minister and took over his office. So through the rest of the 1850s, as prime minister, Cavour cemented a strong centrist coalition, including both moderate liberals and conservatives in parliament. He seized control of the education system and marriage laws away from the church, but did not entirely disestablish the church. He was very diplomatically adept. He signed free trade agreements with all the major powers in Europe except for Russia. He entered Piedmont Sardinia into the Crimean War alongside Britain and France as an ally of the British and the French against Russia, and then persuaded these allies to support Piedmont's position in Italy and to support their claims as against Austria. He aggressively supported new infrastructure within Piedmont, such as rails and telegraph lines, such that by 1859, Piedmont had about half of all the railroad miles in Italy. And Cavour, it seems, didn't especially care about Italian unification per se, right? He was not a nationalist in his heart. He cared about Piedmont's interests. But he did accept the offer of an alliance with the nationalists because he hoped that together they might oust the Austrians, and then Piedmont Sardinia would be able to dominate northern Italy and to annex, most importantly, to annex neighboring Lombardy, which was the territory he cared most about because it was flat, fertile land with good rivers, and in his view was well suited to industrialization. And he believed that that would soon become a major industrial center of Europe. Now, in order to advance these goals, right, in his alliance with the nationalists against Austria, and in order to get a chance of annexing Lombardy, he needed a war with Austria. And it would be best if Austria started it, right? So that then Piedmont and their allies could rally together against Austria. So Cavour stoked resistance and unrest in the Austrian territories, of which there was plenty, right? There were waves of revolt and revolution in the Austrian Empire as well. There were national movements. So he sort of stoked resistance, provoked the Austrians, and he was able to get Austria to break off diplomatic relations with Piedmont, right? So this was an initial sort of victory. But then the real trigger event that set the dominoes falling was in 1858. So in that year, a Mazzinian radical revolutionary went into France, and he wanted to assassinate the new French emperor, Napoleon III, right? So the president, Louis Napoleon, by this time had proclaimed himself emperor under this grandiose title of Napoleon III. And some Mazzinian radicals despised Napoleon III for failing to help the Italian movement and for even interfering in support of the Pope against the Italian revolutionaries. So this radical went incognito into France. He went into Paris, and he was able to throw a bomb at the emperor's carriage when he was on his way to the opera. Now, this attempted assassin was apprehended, and it was found, his background was investigated, his connections, and the incident had very strange and unexpected effects. For one thing, Mazzini was further discredited, right? He was now really out of the picture politically within Italy and abroad. The French emperor, for his part, blamed the radical revolutionaries and also the British, whom he saw as supposedly helping this assassin. And the emperor resolved as a result that he should more vigorously support the moderate nationalist element within Italy, those who had tried to kind of marginalize this radical revolutionary movement and who could serve as possible allies against the radicals and against Britain. And most of all, this meant he should cement an alliance with Piedmont, right? The homeland, the flag bearer of this more moderate Italian national movement. And this ended up playing right into Cavour's hands. So in July 1858, Cavour met privately with the Emperor Napoleon III at a spa in France, and they worked out a complicated secret agreement. And according to this agreement, if Cavour could get Austria to declare war against Piedmont first, right, if he could sort of provoke Austria and get them in the trap, then France would support Piedmont. They would enter the war in support of Piedmont against Austria, and they would help to expel the Austrians from Italy. In return, a Piedmontese princess would have to be married to Napoleon's son, so they'd make this sort of old-fashioned royal marriage alliance. And Piedmont would have to hand over to France the small border counties of Savoy and Nice. And these were small border zones, but they were strategically significant. At least Nice was, a significant port city. And it also was very ironic, considering that Savoy, for its part, was the original birthplace of the Kingdom of Piedmont, right? That's where it had all begun. And Nice was the birthplace of the Italian nationalist hero Garibaldi. But, Cavour was not a sentimentalist. He didn't really care about those connections. He just wanted the strategic pact, so the deal was sealed. And the two leaders also sketched out a plan for Italy after the war, a sort of putative map of what Italy would look like. So Piedmont would get all of the north, including Lombardy, the Veneto, and a big chunk of the northern papal states, right? So those areas around like Bologna, in Emilia-Romagna, Ancona, and Le Marche, where there'd always been a lot of radicalism and resistance against the Pope. Those two would then be annexed by Piedmont. The Grand Duchy of Tuscany would remain in place. The Pope would retain control of the city of Rome and just a small province around it. And meanwhile, the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies would remain in the south. So this sort of arrangement worked fine for them, right? It basically defanged Austria and the papacy. It made Piedmont the main power in the north. But this this plan did not reflect the hopes and aspirations of nationalists for a united Italian state, or even for a confederation like the Neo-Guelphs had hoped for. So nonetheless, in early 1859, both the Emperor Napoleon and the King Vittorio Emanuele of Piedmont made many inflammatory speeches attacking Austria and inciting rebellion against the Austrian throne within the Austrian Empire. Their aim was to bait Austria into a war. And finally, in April 1859, the Austrian government demanded that Piedmont disarm. So, and this was a big demand, right? It goes against Piedmontese sovereignty, and it also meant Piedmont would no longer be an effective buffer state between Austria and France. And when Piedmont refused, Austria then finally declared war. And there was a very short but close-fought war lasting just 2 months. And Garibaldi fought in command in service of Piedmont against the Austrians. France and Piedmont together were able to capture Milan once again. But then, abruptly, France pulled out of the war. It was unpopular at home. Napoleon III was worried about unrest and opposition at home in France. So they pulled out, and this allowed Piedmont then to have Milan and Lombardy, which they had wanted. But it still left the Austrians in control of the Veneto, a very serious, important base, and it left the rest of the Italian peninsula totally unchanged. So nationalists in the rest of Italy were upset, and the war had really fueled this hope and demand for Italian unification, which then couldn't be easily quenched. So in 1860, liberal governments seized control of the Italian duchies and the northern cities of the Papal States like Bologna and Ancona, and all of them then held plebiscites, where the citizens voted overwhelmingly to be annexed to Piedmont. So Piedmont Sardinia, under the governance of Cavour, then gratefully accepted these new territories, which just sort of walked into their hands. And these then outweighed, right? They compensated for and outweighed the loss of Nice and Savoy, which they dutifully handed over to France, right? In accordance with that secret pact. So after all of this, Piedmont Sardinia was now effectively the real hegemon in Italy. They had defeated Austria on the field of battle, taken this important territory of Lombardy, and further territories reaching southward far into central Italy, and they had diplomatically outplayed both the Pope and the French. So the nationalists now all really had to recognize that Piedmont was the almost inevitable vehicle of unification, even as they disliked and distrusted Cavour. For many reasons, right? For giving up Nice and Savoy to the French in this secret deal, and for basically selling out central and southern Italy. Nonetheless, it was universally seen that Piedmont was the real standard bearer now of the cause of unification. Garibaldi himself felt betrayed and resented Cavour for giving away his own hometown to the French. So Garibaldi at this point decided to seize the initiative, right, and to kind of redirect and redefine the movement as a national democratic movement. So Garibaldi learned that there was renewed talk and agitation for a democratic revolution in Sicily. And he knew that the southern kingdom of the two Sicilies had been severely weakened and exposed by the loss of Austrian backing. They were always really a client state of Austria since the Restoration. So they're now very vulnerable. So Garibaldi organizes a small paramilitary force called the 1,000, Les Mille, and they embarked for Sicily. And the hope was that they would lead an uprising, seize control of the island, then march northward in the mainland, seize Naples and then Rome, and finally declare a democratic republic of Italy with its capital at Rome. So Garibaldi and his followers embarked in May, and they were remarkably successful for the first 6 months. After landing, they gathered thousands of volunteers locally and also from all over Italy and abroad. They took possession of Sicily and then marched northward and entered Naples in September. The Bourbon royal family simply fled the country, and Garibaldi set up a provisional military government with a modern administration and police system. Plebiscites were then spontaneously held all across the south, where again the people voted in the majority to be annexed to Piedmont Sardinia. In October, Garibaldi defeated the last Bourbon army north of Naples, and he then had a clear path northward to the main prize, which was Rome. But at this point, Piedmont intervened. They did not want Garibaldi to attack or occupy Rome, and for one thing, they didn't want Garibaldi and his radical Democrats to control a new unified state, which might then abolish the Piedmontese monarchy. Or even worse, they didn't want Garibaldi to possibly provoke the French to invade in order to protect the papacy. And this could lead to a disastrous war or even a Europe-wide war. So the King of Piedmont led the army personally under his command south. He annexed northern parts of the Papal States, including the provinces of Umbria and Le Marche, but he left Rome itself alone. And he was able to go around Rome and intercept Garibaldi before he reached the city. And there was a sort of awkward summit here, a sort of chilly meeting between the king and Garibaldi. And Garibaldi agreed to hand the southern territories over to Piedmont, right? That's what they had voted for in these plebiscites. And so in deference to that democratic principle, he handed them over to Piedmont, Sardinia, and he then retired, at least for the time being, to his home on a small island off Sardinia. And some of the revolutionary soldiers, especially from the south, were furious. They then felt betrayed by Garibaldi, and they refused to accept Piedmontese rule and basically went into the hills and the countryside and took up brigandage and sort of guerrilla resistance against the Piedmont Sardinia regime. In February 1861, a new united Italy was proclaimed, a kingdom of Italy with Vittorio Emanuele as king, with its capital at Turin in Piedmont, and the first national parliament was convened. It happens that one member who was elected to this first parliament was the composer Verdi, who is now very closely identified with the national movement. The prime minister was Camillo Cavour, although he died after just a few months in office. And this new state encompassed all of Italy, if one, excludes Nice and Savoy. It encompassed all of the Italian peninsula, but much of the south was really still beyond their control and in the grip of these anti-northern guerrilla bandits. And the two cities that were still under foreign occupation were the same two that had been the two last holdouts in the 1848 revolutions, Venice and Rome. So Venice and some of the Veneto were still controlled by Austria, and Rome was still under the governance of the Pope, propped up by the French army garrisoned there. So what was the new state to do? Well, in the south, in 1863, the parliament declared martial law, and this began a years-long fight, a kind of low-level civil war, to defeat the southern bandits and to impose the sovereignty of this new state throughout the south. As for Venice and the Veneto, the new kingdom got an opportunity in 1866. So in that year, Austria was pulled into a war against Prussia, basically over dominance in Germany. And Italy capitalized on this. They joined into the war in an alliance with Prussia against Austria, and they were able to seize the Veneto and unite it to the Italian state. So Venice was now part of this Kingdom of Italy. Now, as for Rome, this was the most difficult. So the French were resistant to give up their small garrison force in Rome and to open the path for a move for Italy to remove the Pope from power. And really, if the Italians made any aggressive move to dislodge the French and depose the Pope from control of Rome, this could then provoke a war with France or even trigger a greater international war. Now, in 1862, Garibaldi, ever the intrepid, launched an expedition anyway to try to take Rome, but the Italian army actually intercepted him, right, because of the dangers that presented. In 1865, after several years of peace and calm, the French did begin to slowly draw down their troops and remove this garrison from Rome. So in 1867, Garibaldi again took advantage, launched an attack, but was repelled by the French. Now, finally, in 1870, France as well was drawn into a war with Prussia. So, Bismarck in Prussia was orchestrating all of this conflict, and this was redounding to Italy's benefit. So France was drawn into a war with Prussia, And in this war, this presented a real existential threat, right? The capital at Paris was threatened by the Germans. And so they finally withdrew their remaining troops from Rome in order to defend their homeland. And this finally left the way open for Italy to seize the city, and they occupied, abolished the temporal powers of the Pope, proclaimed religious freedom, abolished the Jewish ghetto, and in February 1871, they moved the capital of the kingdom from Turin to Rome. So this dream of a unified Italy with its capital at Rome was finally fulfilled, although it was under a constitutional kingdom, not a democratic republic. Now, Pope Pius IX, for his part, refused to accept the legitimacy of this new state, and he further believed he was unsafe under the rule of this secular kingdom. So he withdrew into self-imposed isolation, and he ceased to live or preside at San Giovanni in Laterano, the traditional basilica of the Pope, which is more in the center of Rome, and he withdrew to the Vatican Hill and to the small complex of papal buildings around St. Peter's Basilica, and he proclaimed himself a prisoner of the Vatican, right? And that has actually been the real seat of the Pope ever since. And he told pious Catholics throughout Italy not to take part in Italian politics. And the Church and the state of Italy were not reconciled until the 1920s. So this grand project of unification of Italy was now broadly understood as complete, but there were still big problems in this state and how it would work. The new state was still relatively weak compared to other powers in Europe. Much of the country was still poor and backward, undeveloped. The new state did not have very broad or deep popular support. The people who had been the most passionate about unification and national revival, namely the radical Democrats, they had largely left politics. The mission of unification was complete, and they had no great investment and no real place in this liberal constitutional government. And the ruling cadres that did take power, they were mostly liberals from Piedmont, and they didn't generally care all that much about national uplift or revival, and they still had basically local loyalties in the Northwest. And most of all, of course, the government did not have very broad or deep support among the peasantry, which didn't really care all that much about unification or the Risorgimento, right? That had never been their main cause, and they were much more concerned about control of land, rent, taxes, military conscription. So basically, you could say there was a mismatch here between the vision, the radical democratic vision that had started the movement for unification, and the state that was then finally created. There was a mismatch, and the new state, in a way, was just a sort of thin facade put over a country that was still very fragmented and didn't have a strong national economy or administrative system or even a very strong national identity outside of those old revolutionary networks that were now sidelined and disempowered. So this, you could say, was the basic dilemma of the next 40 years or so, leading up to Italy's entry into World War I, right? And the path that Italy took that eventually led them into that war was defined in a lot of ways by this revolutionary history and by the weaknesses of this national Italian kingdom created out of the Risorgimento. So hopefully I'll talk about that soon, but there are, as always, there are other projects I'm going to work on as well, and I'll have to work out the sequence of them. But thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you always for your feedback, for sharing and telling people about the podcast. And lastly, since it's May and we're approaching June, I'd like to thank all of my current active patrons who were originally signed up over the years in the month of June. So thank you to Michael Biagetti, Heather Anderson, Warren Green, Oliver, Atumbe, currently piloting the shuttle from SGU Episode 1, Angelica Falkenstein, Robin McDavid, Brian Cam, Ted Yu, Mike Gervich, Finnegas, Greta Svalberg, Kathy, Bob Talarchik, Diane E. Phillips, Jay Holman, Dan, Fred Cutler, Tori Petty, Michael DeLucia, Alexander Bazis, Pamela Witherspoon, Jane Thomas, Jeremy Mahar, Kuba Vishomirsky, Jerzy Slavinsky, Nato Thompson, Daniela Trozzolo, Nicholas Melling, Gage, Jorge Garza, Ri Anbao, Scott Dinsmore, R.L., Ryan Chang, Samuele Fossati, and Stacy Denning. Thank you.